Second thing that we need to get out of the way before talking about hell is the fact that rules without consequences are meaningless. In other words, there are no moral oughts. There are only rational oughts. Now, what do I mean by that? An example of a moral ought is something like, you ought not kill for entertainment. An example of a rational ought is, if you want to stay out of jail and if you want to have a clean conscience, then you ought not murder for entertainment. But why do I think this? Why am I saying that there are only rational oughts? Why am I saying that we only really consider consequences when dealing with what we ought or ought not do? Well, I'll let Theoretical Bullshit explain. You should watch his full video. It's called Treatise on Morality. There's just a piece of it here. But you really should watch all of Theoretical Bullshit's stuff, including his follow-up videos to Treatise on Morality, because, quite honestly, if anything out there really does grow brain cells, it's watching Theoretical Bullshit's videos.
Now, you may object that what I'm talking about is not a moral ought, it's simply a rational ought. It's rational to behave in certain ways in order to actualize a desired circumstance, but a moral ought is something that we just ought to do unconditionally, period. And you may claim that while an atheistic worldview allows us to derive a rational ought from what simply is the case, it does not allow us to derive a moral ought from what is the case. Well, then I think you should know something. These unconditional moral oughts, as you define them, are a figment of your imagination, even if a God does exist. You can't get an unconditional moral ought from Christianity any more than you can from atheism. For example, the Christian worldview says that there is a creator who brought us into existence and provided us with rules to follow regarding our conduct toward himself and each other, and that these rules are derivative of his character and nature, which happens to be one of love, honesty, justice, etc. But everything I just mentioned, and anything I could possibly mention about Christianity, describes what is the case, not what ought be the case. And there's nothing about God's nature or qualities or existence that changes that. To say that God is all-powerful, or that he has infinite knowledge, or that he's non-physical, or that he exists outside of time and space, or that he's loving or compassionate, still does nothing to explain why the statement, God says to do X, means we ought to do X. Sure, you ought to do what God commands if you want to be saved, if you want to spend eternity with him in heaven, if you want to emulate God's character, and so on, but those would be what you're calling rational oughts, now wouldn't they? To say that God commands us not to engage in homosexual behavior, for example, is a descriptive statement and nothing more. It describes what is the case. It is the case that God commands us not to engage in homosexual behavior. But Christians can't derive a moral ought from that any more than I can derive a moral ought from the statement, California law prohibits texting while driving. Moral oughts, as my detractors define them, simply do not exist in any worldview. They are a complete fiction. There are only rational oughts, whether you recognize this or not. And in any case, I wonder what good Christians think it does to believe in these unconditional moral oughts anyway. If I, for some reason, preferred an unhealthy, unhappy, uncooperative, failing community, if I preferred to alienate myself from relationships that would be beneficial to me, would believing that my behavior violates some unconditional, absolute, intangible moral ought dissuade me from behaving that way? No, not at all. I'm still going to behave whichever way is conducive to my desired circumstance. Now, let's say you told me that the creator of the universe wants me to change my behavior. Well, whether I change my behavior or not is going to be contingent upon whether I care about doing what the creator of the universe wants me to do. Maybe I care, maybe I don't, but however I proceed will be according to which circumstance I desire. What if you told me that I would spend eternity in hell if I continued to behave in this way? Well, whether this works on me or not, it proves that my actions are still contingent upon desired circumstances, not some intangible absolute moral ought. If I wish to avoid hell, I have a reason to change my behavior, but if I prefer hell, I have zero reasons for changing my behavior, and you can bet that I won't. Let's try a thought experiment, okay? Let's imagine that God comes to you and tells you that there are unconditional, transcendent, absolute moral oughts in the universe, things that you just ought do and things that you just ought not do. And it just so happens that all the things that you ought to do will create unfathomable pain, suffering, and injustice, and ultimately land you in hell, where you'll burn and choke and scream and cough for all of eternity. However, all the things that you ought not do happen to promote peace and health and happiness and justice, and will land you in heaven, where you will experience eternal bliss alongside your Creator for all time. Knowing this, how would you live your life? Would you adhere to these intangible, transcendent, unconditional moral oughts? Or not? I hear it argued all the time that if God doesn't exist, nobody has grounds for telling anybody else what they ought or ought not do. But that's so naive. It's so fucking naive. Whether we recognize it or not, our choices and our behavior are simply not informed by these unconditional, transcendent, absolute moral oughts. They're informed by rational oughts, by what circumstances we seek to actualize. And this is true irrespective of God's existence or our belief in Him. The fact is, a world in which these unconditional moral oughts exist would be indistinguishable from a world in which only rational oughts exist. So aside from its inherent triviality, there's certainly no practical advantage to thinking this way either. It does absolutely nothing to give our moral claims a more solid foundation. All it does is serve to make Christians feel warm and fuzzy inside.